started here. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. So, this is a part 2 live to last week's first part, that's redundant, on mental health in the holidays. Okay, so we are a little under a week out towards Thanksgiving, and really, I'm going to keep this brief because we're talking about what I saved from part 1 for today is the bigger, meatier topic of grief. So in my mind, I'm rhyming, so I'm going to keep it brief because we're talking about grief. Not because grief needs to be weird and we need to put it in a box, but because it is such an expansive topic that, going live, I literally work with clients for numerous sessions on grief and really understanding what that looks like for them specifically. So, but why I really wanted to talk about what grief looked like when it comes to the holidays is because I'm going to give y'all just a little cheat code, little tip that if you have that family member, or you're that family member maybe, but if you have that family member who is grouchy, who's just not really the most pleasant to be around, it literally starts all the drama, who is not really, who's that person, the crazy uncle, I'm careful with that word because more than likely, grief is an issue. I know that seems a little counterintuitive because they're just a butthead. I'm I get that. I totally get that. But this is the thing about grief is that there's so many different intersections of what grief actually not only looks like for a human being, but also how it presents in the timeline that none of us are aware of each individual person's relationship with grief. So when I work with my clients, one of the really the hardest thing about mental health and understanding what grief looks like is that it's very continuous. And then you also have the phenomenon of that it's experience of emotion, and then emotion generalizes. So you could be, recently grieving something, or you could be feeling an emotion where you get triggered because you're around a whole lot of people and it's a lot of stress. And it actually, in my mind, I just kind of think of an underground tunnel. It tunnels out of the moment and it connects with other unresolved grief and emotions that are similar to that experience that you're having. So, because the thing is that at this point, whether it's trauma, a loss is trauma. Everything's kind of trauma, really. If it's trauma, it's going to be stored in your body and it's going to be familiar from a somatic, central nervous system standpoint, to the point where, yes, you don't really have any control over it. So that's just, the individual experience. So if you're dealing with the type of person, whether you're that person or it's someone else that you're thinking about dealing with, you're in a position where you're naturally going to be resistant to what it feels like, especially if you're if early on, if you've not even really considered that you have to grieve anything, or, you're just not as familiar with mental health or not as compassionate towards yourself at this point in time, that you're going to naturally be just nope, I'm out. Peace. Let me throw back a drink. Let me take another hit, whatever the case may be, because we don't necessarily want to feel the discomfort and the tension that comes with feeling emotion, right? So let alone cry. We can't even get to what crying is. If we can't eat, well, I guess we can. Crying is really just your body's natural release of energy, because you're not necessarily talking about it. You're not processing it elsewhere. And you're not able, and I use the word you just kind of speaking to whoever sees this, but same thing goes for me. If I'm not talking about the things that are on my mind or the things that I've experienced, then my body is going to have to handle that for me. So it's either going to absorb it, and that's why we continue to expand, or it's going to release it. And that's why our eyes water when at any given point, and your mood's all over the place, is because if you're not going to pay attention to you, your body's going to look out for you to a certain extent. It can't do everything because it's accommodating more and more and more and more and more. So that's my first thing for y'all. When it comes to the holidays, if you're unaware of why the vibe is weird, why there's negative energy, why there's this, why there's that, I want you to stop and consider that, could this person, or could I be grieving something? Or could I be grieving the fact that it's a holiday. So if I'm going to skip to like the next point is like, well, what does grief look like? Pretty plain and simple is that, well, if you've had a loss of a person, relationship, so be it, and this is the first holiday that you have experienced with them. So this is, for if you were dating someone and you guys broke up, if you were working with someone and you left your job, if you have to work on the holiday, because that's also something that, like, just because you're not, someone didn't die, grieving the loss of something is very tricky. To be honest with you, and this is kind of, I don't know if it's a little unrelated, but a lot of people underestimate the power of grief when it comes to losing weight. So if this is your first holiday, either after a surgery of gastric bypass, or for someone like myself, it's not my first holiday, but this is like, I don't eat as much. I have to be prepared. I'm not saying that I'm going to force myself to grieve, but I have to be prepared that if I'm not paying attention to my mood, if my mood is off, that it may be because I just don't get to eat as much anymore, or not care about what I'm doing now and how it's going to impact my goals. And I talked a little bit about that last week in my live about, our relationship with food and how self-sabotage becomes this very prominent concept around this time. And someone had mentioned that I had caused them to feel guilty. And so if that is the case, right, if you're starting to feel that, like, yo, I feel guilty, I don't even want to eat, I don't want to do this, that's something to be mindful for, because that is the that's the natural resistance that grief comes with. So you may be grieving. So guilt may be a sign of just general grief of, like, you know what, you're going to be doing something different this year. It may not be a huge difference. And if anything, it's also a good difference that people, and change that people, as a person is making, you're making. But it also is still going to come with some consequence of loss. You're not going to be able to eat as many cookies. You're not going to be able to eat as much sweet potato pie. You're not going to be able to, but so what do, right? Because naturally we're trained to now focus on what we don't have. We're now grief, just the experience of, like, if this is resonating with anyone, right? If this is the experience that's actually happening, your focus is now mainly on grief. And what I would suggest to you is that that's where you put the pin in it. You take the deep breath, go watch my video called The Recipe, where you can do a little bit of like mind, body, emotional, spirit work to redirect yourself and recourse, because now you have to focus on, ironically, this is just one suggestion I'm going to give, but my first one's always going to be gratitude. And guess what? Thanksgiving is this whole vibe of gratitude. What are we grateful for? So that is a good indicator, or maybe an accountability system of, like, how can you be grateful for the one piece of sweet potato pie that you're going to have, or maybe even two, but then also make sure that you're willing to feel the way that you want to feel while eating the food that you want to eat. Okay? So gratitude is a very good coping skill during grief, but it is not the only coping skill. So this is my biggest thing with, like, just be grateful. Like, oh, well, shouldn't you be grateful for all this? I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't buy it. As much as I think there's a power to gratitude and to be there, and as a mental health clinician, I do not push gratitude on my clients if they're not feeling it, because that's just rude. Like, what am I'm going to be grateful for, like, not feeling the way I want to feel? Yeah, no. It doesn't usually, I would not be the therapist that I am if I continue to do that. So what do you do in that point in time? Well, you have to hold space for it. You have to just be able to be willing to sit with the acknowledgement that, like, it doesn't feel good right now. Finding different ways to outlet that energy would be ideal. So getting up, and this is where I know it's food and football next week, right? That's pretty much Thursday. So the natural inclination and the vibe is going to be sit on the couch, eat, and just chill. But this is also where you can offset, making sure that you get up and you go out and walk. Maybe you do actually participate in football and throw around the football, and you get your body moving a little bit, because that will help with the emotional offset, let alone what you put in your body. I'm not the food police. I'm not for anyone else anyway. If I want to be the food police for myself, that's on me. But I don't do that, because that usually comes with fear and power dynamics that are all internal and We're not talking about that right now. But the point being is the general resistance. So this is, I created an acronym just really more for my brain about what grief really means. The general resistance in emotional flow, GRIEF, general resistance in emotional flow. And what I mean by that is because the natural reaction to grief is that you don't want to feel it. That's why we literally that's why compartmentalization is a concept that we can talk about. It is not healthy long-term, but it is healthy short-term in some instances, at least in my session, in my virtual office. So when we are naturally resistant to emotion because we've trained ourselves to be that way, or we've been conditioned, we've been trained to be that way, then it gets a little tricky. So what resistance looks like is that you're going to be holding your breath, or you could be breathing more, but most people tend to be breath holders when they're resisting something emotionally. It is just kind of like, if you think about it, like you're going to start to cry and you're like, don't want to. That is a grief. Like your body is expressing emotion and you're naturally resisting the emotional flow that comes from the expression of you just experiencing that moment. Okay. So the first thing is, just to recap this so far, is if you're dealing with that family member that is just like the person you want to stay away from, but you got to be around your family. Last week we talked about, like, if you need permission not to go, just don't go. If that really is easy for you, the easiest path of least resistance. But also, and actually just kind of go through last week's live, because I go over some strategies of how you deal with the consequences of not putting yourselves in the rooms that aren't the healthiest for you, because you still have to be prepared for the natural consequences of removing yourself from people that are going to notice that you're not there. So the next thing, so if you're not the next thing, but if you're dealing with that family member who throws the guilt trips, who says inappropriate things to you, who says, like all of that, just consider that the thing that they're going through, you don't have to understand, but more than likely it falls under the umbrella of grief. Because everyone's got their own experience, whether they acknowledge it or not. The older generation, and I'm putting this out there with all respect to all of my older generation people, that they have not had the information to understand mental health prior to our generation. Mental health is a fairly new field of study compared to the general health fields and healthcare field that we have. So what we didn't know 20 years ago, they would have no idea how to apply. What I'm telling you now, I'm 34 years old and I've been in my career for 10 years, and half of this information in the research that has influenced me has only come out in the last 15 to 20 years. So an older generation who's already been through something, who already has a way of coping, who already has a resistance to when they're going through something stressful, they're not going to be as prone to stopping, realizing they're having a reaction, responding to the reaction before you respond to the thing that reacted you or caused you to react, and do something different. And unfortunately, it does come down to the younger generation to kind of redirect and correct some of these patterns. But to be honest with you, it's better for us to be able to do that, because it also allows us to have freedom in the rest of our lives that sometimes other people in older generations didn't get to have. So there is an undertone of gratitude there. So I encourage anyone who does watch this before the holidays, whether it's Thanksgiving, Christmas, is that if you find yourself wanting to react and respond to one of those people in your family, just consider, are they grieving something that you can just kind of let them grieve? Can you find a way in your brain to let me just focus on me? And I'm going to choose not to go down that road, because they're on a road of grief and general resistance of the natural process that you have no business being in. You just have no business being in, and it doesn't have any business disturbing the peace that you've worked on up until this point. Now, if you're the person that people are they're naturally going to avoid, that can be hurtful too. And there's a grief issue, right? I really just put this out there, is just remember that your hurt is only in the moment of when it is experienced, but it is also connected to the multitude of hurt that you've experienced in other places. So when we were talking earlier about how emotion generalizes, If this is a holiday of loss for first-time people, then you want to consider that you're going to be a little bit more fragile. I'm not going to say that you're sensitive, because then there's a lot of stigma to that, but a little bit more, proceed with caution and compassion for yourself. And in turn, you're going to have more compassion for other people, and just for that moment, just for that day. Because if you feel off, everyone else is going to feel it too, but you don't necessarily have to go force them to feel it, because more than likely the people in the room, they already felt the shift anyway. So, and then it just gets confusing from there, because then it's like, yo, whose vibe is this? Because then you start pissing people off and it gets transferred to everyone, and it's messy. Trust me, I see it happen in group therapy all the freaking time, and there's a lot of, I wouldn't call it pressure at this point for me, but there's a lot of responsibility to be mindful of, like, when one person has a reaction and how easily it can affect other people, and let alone other people who know each other and that care about each other. The saving grace in group therapy is that most people do not have that interrelational or interconnection in their family or anything like that. So it doesn't spread as easily, because people are like, oh, the person I care about has like a different facial expression, and then they don't empathize with that person, right? So it doesn't pass along as quickly, but it still happens. So that is grief, right? So this is a huge, so whether it's you lost someone, whether it's, you're not going to be able to eat as much food because you're really wanting to like not give up on yourself this holiday. I'm putting that out there for the people who are like my binge eating recovery, or just codependency, like just trying to be healthier in general. You can still eat all the food, unless you have like a severe sensitivity to it. Then I don't really recommend to cause like too much disruption to yourself. But enjoy the food, but don't let it get so far away from you that you trigger your own cycle, and then start to, or push yourself past that limit where you can't make that mindful choice, and you're starting to deal with consequences, 2-3 days after the fact. Okay. So look out for guilt, because guilt is a very easy trigger for that grieving process, and just the general resistance to what it is that we're not always good at dealing with individually, let alone dealing with in front of people, like crying, like talking, like processing. And it's very easy to rehash things. So this last point of when it comes to grief, I was having this conversation with a client this week, and I feel like it's a big thing, because holidays, or, families do tend to come together more. Alcohol tends to be a little bit higher. And considering that I have the addiction specialist, I do have a lot more experience with substance abuse specific recovery. But is that when you have a family member who you care about that doesn't necessarily see their problem with alcohol, you're actually not just getting angry or pissed off or confronting them or telling them about themselves. You're actually grieving right in front of them. So the thing about grief is that whether it's a loss of someone who's no longer here, or an identity that you lose, right? There are plenty of situations that we're in, just generally as human beings, where we start to grieve when people are still alive, or we grieve right in front of them, and we're not even, or right in our own space, not even realizing that we're having to deal with grief. So this conversation came up with a client of mine who has a parent who has a strong relationship with alcohol, and their feedback ultimately is just very significant of like, they have no intention of changing, a huge, very denial pattern of like it even being a problem for the family, right? And they don't see the consequences of their own behavior. And it is so natural to be angry about the situation, but I would challenge you, one, consider that that's not anger, not necessarily that it's just grief, but if it's another emotion such as sadness, disappointment, hurt, shame, because maybe like there's some situations where if you're drinking with this other person, you're like, and you feel like, yo, I don't agree with this person because they're hurting themselves, but yet you're not going to want to stop living your life to be able to, have a drink, and because you don't have a problem or an unhealthy relationship with alcohol, then it's naturally going to surface as anger. Anger is one of the most socially acceptable emotions that we have, but it's one of the most deceiving emotions too. So if you go over into my app, the Power and Perspective app, There is a specific worksheet that, or you can Google it, honestly, because it's one of the most common therapeutic worksheets, is the anger iceberg. And consider it's more of a visual, because like the tip of the iceberg looks like anger, like, yo, I'm pissed. I'm like, and if I were to challenge you, be like, are you really angry? Those be like, yeah, I'm annoyed. I'm like, okay, still kind of angry. But then it eventually wears down into what's usually ends up being more shame or sadness. And shame tends to happen, especially when you're actually doing the behavior, like I was mentioning before, of drinking while you're disapproving of this other person drinking because they're hurting themselves a lot more than you. But because you now got skin in the game, because you're now doing something that brings a relatability, sometimes if you have more of a relationship or unhealthy relationship with shame in other areas of your life, then that could also become a very big issue for you in that moment. So it is, I know this is a lot, and this is why I said I was going to try to be brief, as in 21 minutes in, I think this is going to be my last point, is be careful about how closely you relate to someone else's grief. And if you're really, and being mindful of like, are you really that person? If you see someone who's not doing well, are you equipped to actually open up and hold space for them? Or can you at least validate them and say like, hey, I see you struggling today. Like, is there anything that I can do to help you through this time? And if they don't know, just making sure that they have water around them and food, because can tell you a whole lot, is like, even though you have a lot of food around, a lot of people don't end up actually eating if they're going through something, and you wouldn't even notice because everyone else is eating. And so sometimes people can slip through the cracks and they actually don't end up eating that much, which is causing them to have more of an emotional reaction that misses and sometimes can cause conflict. Sometimes it can cause, and because they're just drinking. So I'm not asking y'all to be someone's parent, but there's probably a lot of people who are going to be someone's parent on this day. But I'm asking you to consider paying attention to yourself. And if you are dealing with a situation that you know is going to be challenging for you, as we talked about last week, having your plan, having your coping strategies already identified for you with you. So packing a bag ahead of time with certain things that will help kind of give you a break, or going for a walk and getting moving and getting out and getting fresh air. But just being mindful that like, there are so many different circumstances where grief could be playing a part in a holiday situation, whether it's for yourself or for someone else, and how that could actually bring you a degree and a perspective of compassion to keep you calm versus keeping you angry, hopefully that makes sense. So, I don't necessarily, I've been missing a chat. Yes, absolutely. So I don't necessarily, if anyone has any questions or certain like circumstances that you want to talk about, but if you do have that, I actually have a free workshop coming up on Monday. I decided to do like a holiday series prep workshop for people who have more of a specific challenging circumstance or a person that they're going to be dealing with, that will go over some, not only just strategies, but actual techniques of communication when it comes to setting boundaries for yourself. Boundaries are not necessarily always for other people and to keep them out. They're more for yourself and for accountability of, okay, this is what I need. This is where my alarm system is telling me, all right, we gotta start exiting. We gotta start doing something. And we'll go over some of some tips, some tricks, but then also some actual techniques of communication on how you start to stay in line with the things that are going to keep you healthy and keep your mental health as stable as possible, because this is just the first of the holidays. Then we have, I guess, 2 more with Christmas and New Year's coming up pretty darn quickly. So that is all I got for y'all today, because grief is something that is a lifelong topic, but it definitely sometimes needs to just be more brief in itself. So if you want to play back and listen to what I had mentioned, the points that I'd brought up with how you kind of embrace grieving during this time and being intentional about it. I know for me, it is something that I grieve during mostly Thanksgiving. Christmas has been something for a longer part of my life having to grieve, because it's a vulnerable conversation, right? So I guess we're at like 17 years now, but 17 years ago, My father died in October. So the holidays have always been a little bit weird, since that happened, because see, it literally is the end of October, and then within the month, we have holidays that have strong associations with having a parent there. And yeah, everything that I just said in this whole live that is a consideration to the fact that like have had to live it since I was 16 years old, and it's something to flow with. It is something that is going to naturally feel like you want to resist it, but I remind you, like, just release it. And a somatic exercise too is because since a lot of emotion gets held in the chest or in the diaphragm area, trying to either lay down or stretch like and open up your chest area can sometimes help you release and not resist as much, because it is just natural that when we're experiencing pain, emotional pain specifically, that we are going to protect it. We're going to close in on it physically. So a lot of it is, if you can just kind of recorrect, take that deep breath, you'll actually be able to like expand a little bit more. And that's just another natural way of not resisting it. So that's all I got for y'all today about grief and the holidays. So I really hope you guys enjoy your Thanksgiving. If anyone is interested in the family strategy holiday prep sesh, that is on Monday the 20th at 6 p.m. virtually. So just DM me if you want to get in on it. It is a free, just 1 hour strategy session of how you navigate those tough boundaries, intrusive family members, whatever it could be. I think there's going to be a mix of people, because we got some of my clients with alcohol, like, whether it's substance use, but it's really about like the boundaries within yourself and also with the boundaries that you have to keep with other people. And it's a lot to handle. It's a lot. So we're going to just prepare ourselves and do the best we can, because everything else at that point is supposed to happen for your own experience. So I hope you guys enjoy your weekend. That's all I got. You're welcome, Ken, for that. I'm glad. I hope this helps someone just for accountability, or if I gave you a nugget, definitely please comment so I can make sure I like actually tried to, or I know that, what part helped people. And take care of yourselves. Get some rest, get some sunshine, because it's supposed to be a great weekend as well. And I will not see you next week. Next Friday, I'm taking a break from being live. I'm going to be actually speaking on Friday on a panel. So if I can go live for that, I'll try to, but it won't be the stereotypical topic-based live. But I will see you the week after next. Peace. Have a good day, guys.